Alrighty, peeps of the interwebs, again, don't worry, 360, there have been no alligator sightings in this entire pond. Gonna see if we can catch a fish tonight on the first cast, while I summarize today's Fani Willis hearing, the motion for demur, or motion for special demur, to dismiss the charges against Trump in particular, on the basis that all of the accusations against Donald Trump in the RICO, Georgia nonsense relate to protected First Amendment activity. There were a couple of motions pending. There was one by the defendant Schaefer, who is accused of impersonating a public officer when they submitted their alternate slate of electors for certification. We'll get there in a second. But Sadow, Trump's attorney, presented some good arguments that I'm predicting are not going to be withheld by Judge Scott McAfee, arguing that basically all of the alleged criminal conduct, the alleged violative conduct in support of the bogus RICO charges pertains to First Amendment protected speech. Sadow rightly pointed out that basically, I had a bite on the first cast. Basically, all of the accusations against Trump allege that the speech that he engaged in was false and was in furtherance of the RICO plot to overturn the results in the Georgia election. Sadow pointed out to say all that they're saying is that what Trump said was false, that the election was stolen, that there was fraud, whatever. And so what he said was false. So when he tweeted out what the state of Georgia argues were false statements, that constitutes furtherance of the felony that they charged him with, but that it only relates to speech, and it's not because speech is false that it becomes felonious. And he said, in fact, that's the very type of speech that you need to protect, because if you only protect truthful speech, well, that's protection without an object. And so he basically argued that the entire indictment revolves around protected First Amendment speech. Okay, the prosecutors come in and argue, yeah, well, you know, the acts in furtherance of a RICO crime, it's a crime, AOC, RICO, can be, yeah, I got a fish, and it's a big one. Ooh, it's a big one. Gonna set the hook, it's gonna jump. They can be lawful acts. It threw the hook, and it was a big one. They can be lawful acts. Oh, that's very frustrating, that was a big fish. But, they can be lawful acts in furtherance of the fraudulent scheme. And that was the bulk of the argument. I mean, I don't see Judge Scott McAfee dismissing it at this point, because the question as to whether or not it was intent behind the statements is going to be one of evidence, and not one that can be determined as a matter of law right now. At one point during the pleadings, Scott McAfee mentioned something along the lines of, well, isn't this something more appropriate for a directed verdict after evidence has been adduced? You adduce the evidence, and then you say, look, they haven't adduced any evidence of any felonious intent behind what might otherwise turn out to be false statements. And the judge basically said, yeah, isn't that more appropriate on a directed verdict? Sadow says, well, by the time you get to a directed verdict, you've already subjected the defendants to a trial, to serious prejudice based on protected First Amendment speech. That's how it went for that. I don't think Scott McAfee is going to dismiss the charges on the basis submitted by Sadow. Then you get to Schaefer, who's another one of the defendants who's accused of impersonating a public officer when they submitted their alternate slate of electors. The question that was being raised is whether or not the electors, those slate of electors, are public officials or public officers under Georgia law. And the argument being raised by Schaefer's attorney is that they are not public officials under the law, therefore you could not be impersonating public officials because they're not public officials. Then you had the prosecution come in and say, no, they're basically public officials, officers, whatever you want to call them. They have an official function, and therefore it is illegal to impersonate them. Impersonate in quotes. I wasn't convinced by that argument, even though I want to see the defendants have all of these charges tossed, because I think they're garbage. I think the better argument then arguing that the electors are not public officials or public officers susceptible of impersonation would have been to argue that there was no impersonation. They're being prosecuted for having submitted forged documents. What were those forged documents? They weren't documents signing someone's signature that wasn't the person signing. There was no impersonation going on here. Nobody came in and said, I'm the duly elected electorate. Nobody came in and said, here's the certificate, and I signed it knowing that I'm not the person authorized to sign it in the name of someone else. They were coming in and submitting an alternate slate of electors, which is arguably, but not arguably, permissible under the law. It's a perfectly plausible constitutional remedy to say we challenge the outcome of this election. We're submitting an alternate slate of electors. We're not pretending to be the electors, hence no impersonation. Yes, that's a fish. Hence no impersonation. Yes, bring it up here. Bring it up here. Is that a fish? That is a rock. Dude, I actually just caught a rock on that's an absolute straight up rock. It's the biggest rock I've ever caught, I'll tell you what. All right, well, where was I? How many times is that going to happen in life? It's never happened to me before. The argument should be that they were not, set aside the argument as to whether or not they're public officials, public officers susceptible of impersonation. There was no impersonation. Jane did not come in and say, I'm Susie. Jane came in and said, I believe that I should be the alternate slate of electors. My name is Jane, and Susie should not be recognized as the legitimate electors. But they didn't make that argument. Scott McAfee listened to the arguments for about 2 hours. Going to take it under deliberation. I don't see it going anywhere at this point, so my prediction is that the motions for demurrer get dismissed, and at best what Scott McAfee is going to do is what he suggested, deal with it on a directed verdict later on. Something ain't that. There was a discussion at one point about whether or not certain terminology was necessary in the indictment, referring to allegedly fraudulent electors or valid electors, the qualification of electors in the indictment. The judge was asking the prosecution, do you need this extra verbiage to refer to them as lawful or unlawful electors? Maybe thinking that there'd be some concession to ask them or strike certain terms from the indictment that would not be prejudicial or impugning. Irrelevant. Bottom line, I don't think the charges are getting dismissed. I don't think the argument for First Amendment violations is going to be held. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention also, there was a bit of an argument as to whether or not it would be facial First Amendment violations or as applied. That being that the idea that is the law underpinning all of this fundamentally unconstitutional and that it's violative of the First Amendment, or is it a lawful or otherwise lawful provision of law that's being applied unlawfully to speech? They argued that, and I think they all agreed that it's not the law itself that is facially invalid, it's as applied in this particular case, because apparently under Georgia law, whatever RICO provisions are being applied here have been upheld as being lawful on their face, and so the question is only as applied here, is it a First Amendment violation? We'll see. I don't think so, because at the end of the day, McAfee basically intimated that this is going to require evidence of intent. It's going to require evidence as to how the terms were used in furtherance of what scheme or not in furtherance of what scheme. And that's it. Now you know your vlog, peeps. I'm going to go put another worm on this and fish a little bit because I had a big one. Got to set the hook more mercilessly in the future. Like, share, subscribe. Viva Frei on Rumble. Viva Frei on Twitter. VivaBarnesLaw.locals.com. On Locals, where everyone is above average. Peace, peace. Booyah! As if it wasn't enough that I caught a rock on camera, I was just fishing on the way home. And good news, I caught a bass and a spotted garfish, which absolutely destroyed my lure. This lure is now officially retired, but I'll show you the pictures of the two beautiful fish. It has been a successful evening. A vlog and 2 fish and a rock. The rock's in my pocket, by the way, right there. Booyah. Peace.